I had been dancing with the lonely woman by the window for over an hour, laughing at her jokes and spinning her across the floor, when my colleague grabbed my arm with a face like death and whispered that I had just spent 60 minutes casually waltzing with the most feared vampire queen in the galaxy. Kael Rivers blinked, feeling as if he'd been hit by a wave of cold air. His heart thumped against his ribs, but not from fear, more astonishment. "Marcus, you're being ridiculous," Kael said, trying to pull free and return to where Queen Selivra had disappeared into the crowd. "Kael!" Marcus's grip tightened painfully on his arm, pulling him further away from the dance floor. His face was pale as he whispered urgently, "That woman can't be approached casually. You have no idea what you've done." "You think I don't know?" Kael said dryly, glancing back towards where Queen Selivra had been standing. She was nowhere to be seen in the crowd of dancers and mingling guests. "She's the vampire queen," Marcus hissed through clenched teeth. "You should have bowed at her feet just for a glance." Kael rolled his eyes despite himself. "I don't work that way, remember? I see people as people first." A shiver ran down Kael's spine. Marcus was right, he could be in serious trouble. Yet the thought of Queen Selivra being terrified or isolated made something twist inside him. "I just wanted to talk," Kael defended himself, though his voice faltered slightly at Marcus's intense stare. "Kael," Marcus growled, "this is not your world. You cannot dance with royalty as if you're back on Earth." I didn't know." Kael's eyes darted around the room in search of her again. He wanted to check if she was okay after his sudden departure. She'd looked so genuinely pleased when they were dancing, and now, "Just be thankful no one saw," Marcus muttered darkly. Kael nodded stiffly, but couldn't stop himself from thinking about those moments with Queen Selivra. The way her long black hair had shimmered in the light of Meridian Crossing's observation windows, how she'd looked so relieved to find someone who didn't judge or fear her for a change. It was such an alien concept, and yet, "Kael," Marcus said again firmly. He turned back towards his colleague with reluctance, but nodded. "Let's get some air." They stepped outside onto the balcony of Meridian Crossing Station, cool night wind rushing against their faces as they gazed out at a sea of stars beyond the galaxy's edge. The diplomatic gala was still bustling inside, oblivious to what could be an impending disaster. Kael looked back towards the open doors one last time before turning his attention fully on Marcus. "What now?" Marcus shook his head, looking bewildered himself. "I don't know how we'll explain this," he said softly, almost to himself. "Tell them I was being a diplomat for once and didn't realize it until afterwards," Kael suggested with a wry smile. Marcus snorted, but smiled back despite the worry lines etched deep into his forehead. "That sounds like something you would do." Kael nodded, trying to push away thoughts of Queen Selivra's red eyes filled with surprise when she'd accepted his invitation to dance. He needed to focus on resolving this mess before it escalated. "I need a drink," he said finally, steering them back towards the entrance. "To think about what we're going to do next." Marcus sighed, but followed him inside again, without further argument. As they made their way through the crowd once more, Kael couldn't help but feel that something had changed tonight. Something small yet profound, and it wasn't just his encounter with Queen Selivra. Kael stood frozen, his mind racing as Marcus's words echoed in his ears. "Her touch is considered dangerous. Dancing with her requires months of political negotiation." Kael looked back at the dance floor, where Queen Selivra had been standing just moments ago. She was no longer there, but he could feel her gaze on him, a sharp contrast to the warm smiles and easy conversation they'd shared. Marcus continued his urgent whispering. "You just walked up and asked her casually." Kael's heart pounded in his chest as reality crashed down around him. He had been so lost in their dance, completely unaware of her status or the potential consequences of what he was doing. Yet, now that Marcus had said it aloud, fear began to creep into his mind. He spun back towards where she stood by the windows, an ethereal figure whose presence commanded attention and respect. She hadn't moved since he left. Instead, she watched him with eyes that seemed to see right through him. Kael walked over slowly, not knowing what to expect or how this moment would unfold. Selivra's expression was guarded, a stark contrast to the softness in her gaze during their dance. He stopped before her. "So, you are a vampire queen?" She lifted her chin and met his eyes with an intensity that both intrigued and unsettled him. "I am," she replied, not hiding the slight chill in her voice, as if waiting for some kind of reaction from him. Kael nodded slowly, trying to process what Marcus had told him while also holding on to the connection he felt with Selivra. "That explains why everyone was avoiding you." She waited for some form of apology or explanation that would distance them further than they already were. But instead, Kael offered his hand. "The music is still playing, and I promised you at least 3 more dances before I stepped on your feet the full 3 times. Her eyes widened slightly as she stared down at his outstretched hand, and then back up to meet his gaze again. He was offering her a chance for normals, something so rare that it almost seemed surreal given who he now knew she was. "You still want to dance, knowing what I am?" Her voice held a mix of curiosity and uncertainty, as if seeking validation beyond just the physical act of dancing together once more. He shrugged with an air of nonchalance despite his racing heart. "You are the same woman who laughed at my cheese story 5 minutes ago," Kael said softly, looking into her eyes for any sign of doubt or fear that might break this fragile connection between them. "The crown does not change that." Her blood-red eyes glistened with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite place, a combination of surprise and something deeper, perhaps hope. "You are either very brave or very foolish," she whispered back, her voice barely above the hum of the gala around them as people continued their conversations and dances, oblivious to this pivotal moment unfolding between 2 strangers who had shared an hour so casually yet intimately. Kael pulled his hand closer towards hers. "My mother always said both." And without hesitation, Selivra took it. He led her back onto the dance floor where they'd started just over an hour ago. The crowd watched in disbelief as a human and a vampire queen moved gracefully across the polished floors once more. As they waltzed to the soft strains of music drifting from unseen speakers throughout Meridian Crossing Station, Selivra leaned closer until she was whispering directly into his ear. "Why are you not afraid?" He held her tighter against him, feeling her cool skin beneath their layers of formal attire. Her closeness calmed some of his nerves, but also brought back the memories of how alone she must have felt standing there by those windows before he came along. "Because for the past hour," Kael murmured softly, as they spun around each other with fluid ease, "you were not a queen. You were someone who wanted to dance, and nobody would ask." His voice softened even further at this admission, something that had been bothering him since Marcus's warning rang in his ears. She rested her head on his shoulder briefly before pulling back slightly so they could look each other straight in the eye again. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smell, a rare and precious thing he realized would be worth all of this risk, if only for that one moment shared between them tonight, under starlit skies, far from home. "It is," Selivra whispered back gently before returning her gaze to their feet as they continued moving together into the night. Kael and Selivra's dance continued, but the atmosphere around them had shifted. The crowd watched in a mixture of awe and unease as they glided across the floor, no longer the easy companionship that marked their first hour together, but instead an exchange charged with unspoken tension. Suddenly, Ambassador Krath intercepted them between dances. His face was purple with fury. "This is a diplomatic outrage. I have spent 6 months negotiating for a formal audience with Her Majesty, and this human casually dances with her for an hour." Selivra's warmth vanished instantly. Ice replaced it as she turned to Krath. "You spent 6 months preparing political proposals," she said coolly. "He spent 60 seconds asking if I wanted to dance." Kael looked from Selivra to the furious ambassador, his heart racing with uncertainty. "Protocol demands that formal invitations be extended and accepted under proper ceremonial decorum," Krath sputtered, trying desperately to maintain composure. Selivra stepped closer to him. "Protocol demanded that I stand alone at every event for 300 years, because everyone was too afraid or too calculating to simply ask me to dance. She looked directly into Kael's eyes and offered a reassuring smile before addressing the room again. This man saw a lonely woman and approached her. Not a queen, not a political opportunity, a woman. Kael squeezed Selivra's hand, offering support as she spoke with authority, but also genuine warmth towards him. Do you know how rare that is? Selivra's gaze softened momentarily before hardening again at Krath's continued protests. I owe him more than a dance, she concluded, pulling Kael closer. For that, I want to offer something in return. She led them out of the main hall and onto a private balcony overlooking the starlit expanse outside Meridian Crossing Station. The room gasped collectively as Selivra took Kael's hand again, this time leading him away from prying eyes and curious onlookers. As they reached the quiet sanctuary of the balcony, she turned to face him fully, under the moonlight streaming through the viewport. You have complicated my life enormously, Kael Rivers, she said quietly, but with a smile that softened her usually commanding demeanor. Kael winced at this admission. Sorry about that. Selivra laughed softly, a sound both unexpected and captivating. Do not be. It is the best complication in 300 years. She reached out to touch his cheek gently, her fingers cool against his skin, but warm with emotion. Her eyes softened as she met Kael's gaze. Why? Are you not afraid? She asked again, more sincerely this time. Kael shrugged honestly, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. Because for the past hour, you were not a queen. You wanted to dance, and nobody would ask. He paused, his words ringing true even if they surprised him too. You deserved better. Selivra's expression shifted from surprise to something like reverence as she looked at Kael in that moment. That is rare indeed, she murmured. I have not felt seen so truly since, I cannot remember when. She stepped closer, her hand lingering on his cheek now with an almost hesitant tenderness. The intensity of the balcony's quiet darkness seemed to magnify every brush of skin and exchange of glance between them. Kael held her gaze steadily back, feeling a connection deeper than anything he had ever experienced before, something that transcended titles, fears, or even species barriers entirely. We should not let it be rare, he replied firmly, but gently. It shouldn't take centuries to find such moments. Selivra's smile grew genuine and warm, something Kael could only describe as a glimpse into the heart of someone long kept under ice. I agree, she said softly before reaching out again to squeeze his hand tightly in her own. The stars shone brightly beyond them, but it was Selivra's eyes that were truly luminous, Noah's, if reflecting back every rare and precious moment they shared together despite all odds. And for the first time since their unexpected dance began, Kael felt not just a connection with someone extraordinary, but also hope for something greater than either of them might have ever imagined before. The private balcony was a sanctuary of calm, offering a panoramic view of the starlit expanse outside Meridian Crossing Station. The air was cool and crisp against Kael's skin as he stood close to Selivra, both of them lost in their own thoughts yet acutely aware of each other's presence. Selivra turned toward him, her blood-red eyes reflecting a mix of wonder and apprehension. I should tell you what happens now, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to pierce the silence between them. Kael braced himself, his heart beating rapidly in his chest as he tried to anticipate what was coming next. Am I in political trouble? He asked cautiously, not wanting to misinterpret her words or intentions. Selivra shook her head with surprising gentleness. The opposite, she replied. You publicly showed me kindness without any agenda. By vampire custom, that creates a bond. Kael's eyes widened as he processed what Selivra was telling him. What kind of bond? She met his gaze directly, the intensity in her blood-red eyes making it impossible for Kael to look away. The kind that means I am now invested in your well-being publicly, she explained. She paused briefly before adding softly, it also means I am interested in you personally. Kael was silent as he contemplated this new information, his mind racing with the implications and possibilities. After a moment of reflection, he asked hesitantly, "So by asking you to dance?" Selivra smiled slightly at Kael's curiosity, her lips curving upwards ever so gently. "You accidentally began a courtship by vampire tradition," she clarified. "One dance is curiosity. An hour of dancing is declaration of intent." Kael laughed weakly in response, his initial shock giving way to an almost comical realization. "Of course it is." Selivra studied him for a moment longer before continuing with a more serious tone. "I could release you from it," she offered gently. "Publicly state it was a misunderstanding. You could return to your normal life." Kael thought about her words, considering the weight of what he had initiated and the consequences that might follow if he decided otherwise. His mind wandered back to their dance and the rare moments of connection they shared despite all odds. "And you would go back to standing alone at every event," he said quietly, after a moment's pause. Selivra looked away, clearly uncomfortable with this notion, but unwilling to admit it outright. "That is not your concern," she insisted stubbornly. Kael stepped closer and reached out hesitantly, his hand gently touching her arm before moving up to take hers in both of his hands. "What if I want it to be my concern?" he asked firmly. Selivra froze at the touch, startled by Kael's unexpected boldness, but also intrigued by his genuine interest in understanding her circumstances and desires beyond their initial dance. "You do not know what you are saying," she warned him with a hint of caution in her voice. Kael lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against the cool skin as he looked into her eyes earnestly. "I know I just spent the best hour of my life dancing with a woman who laughs at cheese jokes and looks at the stars like she is lonely," he said sincerely. He met Selivra's red gaze steadily, his resolve clear and unwavering. "I know that I do not want you to stand alone anymore." Selivra stared back at him in silence for what felt like an eternity before her expression softened incrementally, the ice around her heart beginning to crack ever so slightly under Kael's persistent warmth and affection. "You would court a vampire queen?" she asked quietly, but with genuine curiosity. "The politics alone." Kael shrugged nonchalantly despite the enormity of his decision. "I accidentally started an interstellar incident by asking someone to dance," he replied lightly, trying to quell her concerns through humor. "How much worse can it get?" Selivra laughed softly, but genuinely for perhaps the first time in centuries, pulling Kael closer and pressing a kiss against his cheek, a gesture both intimate and full of promise. "Much worse," she admitted with a smile, "but also much better." Kael grinned back at her, feeling an overwhelming sense of hope and excitement as he realized they might just be starting something truly extraordinary together. "Then let us find out together," he proposed eagerly. Their courtship would become the talk of the galaxy in the weeks that follow, diplomatic negotiations held hostage by casual encounters on starlit balconies, formal galas where human diplomats no longer stood alone, and endless stories shared between friends about how a simple dance under alien stars had changed two lives forever. 3 months later, Meridian Crossing.